On April 1st, 2026, 4 astronauts climbed into the Orion spacecraft, strapped themselves to 8.8 million pounds of thrust, and launched toward the moon. The world watched. The footage was beautiful. The rocket cleared the tower, the boosters separated clean, and within 8 minutes, the crew was in orbit. Everyone cheered. It was the first time human beings had left low Earth orbit in over 50 years. The first woman to fly to the moon was on board. The first black astronaut to travel beyond Earth orbit. The first Canadian in deep space. It was, by every measure, a historic moment. But buried beneath the celebration is a problem that almost no one is talking about. And the 4 people it affects most are currently 250,000 miles from home, with no way to fix it. The problem is the heat shield. And to understand why it matters, you need to understand what it does. When Orion returns from the moon, it will slam into Earth's atmosphere at roughly 25,000 miles per hour. That is faster than any crewed re-entry in the history of spaceflight. At that speed, the air in front of the capsule cannot move out of the way fast enough. It compresses, superheats, and forms a sheath of plasma around the spacecraft that reaches temperatures close to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly half as hot as the surface of the sun. The only thing standing between the crew and that inferno is a layer of ablative material called AV-coat, bonded to the bottom of the capsule. AV coat is designed to burn away in a controlled, even pattern, absorbing the heat and carrying it away from the spacecraft as it chars and vaporizes. That is the theory. On December 11th, 2022, during the uncrewed Artemis I mission, the theory failed. When engineers recovered the Orion capsule after splashdown and inspected the heat shield, they found something deeply alarming. The AV-coat material had not ablated smoothly. It had cracked. In over 100 locations, chunks of the material had broken off in irregular patterns, leaving behind an uneven, damaged surface that looked nothing like what the computer models had predicted. This was not minor cosmetic wear. The NASA Office of Inspector General later documented 3 categories of failure, severe enough to pose what they called significant risk to a crew. The first was the spalling itself, the cracking and ejection of heat shield material, which can expose the unprotected capsule structure underneath to direct plasma heating. The second was even more concerning. 4 large separation bolts sit embedded in the heat shield. These bolts are packed with heat-resistant material and are supposed to survive the full force of re-entry. 3 of the 4 had melted through their thermal barriers entirely. The Inspector General's report stated plainly that separation bolt melt beyond the thermal barrier during re-entry can expose the vehicle to hot gas ingestion behind the heat shield, exceeding Orion's structural limits and resulting in the breakup of the vehicle and loss of crew. The third category involved power distribution anomalies during the flight. There were 3 different failure modes, any one of them in a worst case capable of killing everyone on board. NASA's initial response was to downplay the findings. Early press releases emphasized that both the rocket and spacecraft had performed exceptionally. The agency declined to publish the full post-flight assessment. The first public mention of heat shield damage came months later, buried in a call with reporters when the Orion program manager described more variations across the heat shield than we expected, and said the ablation had behaved differently than what our computer models and ground testing predicted. When pressed to quantify the damage, officials described it as very small, localized areas, and noted it would actually be easier to analyze if the chunks had been larger and more defined. That is not the language of an agency that fully understands what happened. That is the language of an agency that is trying to figure out what happened, while simultaneously telling the public everything is fine. So what did happen? After over a year of investigation and more than 120 individual tests, NASA arrived at an explanation. The AV-coat material was not porous enough. During re-entry, the heat shield generates gases internally as it chars. Those gases need to filter to the surface and escape. On Artemis I, they could not. The pressure built up beneath the surface layer, and when it exceeded the material's structural strength, the shield cracked and ejected chunks of charred avcoat in unpredictable patterns. The problem was compounded by the reentry profile Artemis had flown, a technique called skip reentry. In a skip reentry, the capsule dips into the upper atmosphere, uses aerodynamic drag to slow down, and then bounces back out into space before re-entering for its final descent. It is like skipping a stone across a pond. The technique gives mission planners more control over where the capsule lands, but it also subjects the heat shield to repeated cycles of heating and cooling, and NASA's investigation concluded that those thermal cycles were a primary driver of the gas buildup that caused the cracking. The heating would drive gases into the material, the cooling would allow pressure to accumulate, and the next heating cycle would push the system past its breaking point. Here is where the decision gets difficult. The Orion capsule for Artemis II was already built. Its heat shield was already bonded to the spacecraft. It was the same avcoat configuration that had just failed on Artemis I, and according to reporting, it was actually slightly less permeable than the Artemis I version, meaning gases would have an even harder time escaping. To remove the heat shield, redesign it, and install a new one would take years. It would push Artemis II from 2025 to late 2026 or 2027 at the earliest, delay every subsequent mission in the program, and cost hundreds of millions of dollars at a time when the agency was already under intense political pressure to show progress. So NASA chose a different path. They would keep the heat shield as is and change the way the capsule comes home. Instead of a skip re-entry, Artemis II would fly a steeper, more direct descent. One continuous plunge into the atmosphere with no bounce, no thermal cycling, and no repeated heating and cooling stress on the material. NASA's models showed that this approach would expose the shield to higher peak temperatures, but for a shorter duration. And critically, it would eliminate the conditions that caused the gas buildup on Artemis I. The agency ran simulations with scenarios involving even more extensive heat shield damage than Artemis I had experienced, and concluded that the underlying capsule structure would remain intact. An independent review team led by Paul Hill, a former lead shuttle flight director who had overseen the return-to-flight program after the Columbia disaster, examined NASA's analysis and concurred with the decision to fly. The crew was briefed. The crew accepted the risk. The mission moved forward. But not everyone agreed. Charles Camarda is a former NASA astronaut, a former director of engineering at Johnson Space Center, and one of the agency's foremost experts on thermal protection systems. He has spent decades studying heat shields. When NASA invited him to review their analysis in January 2026, he came away more alarmed, not less. In an interview with CNN, Camarda was asked directly whether Artemis II was safe to fly. His answer was unambiguous. He said no. He argued that NASA had built what he called toy models to justify the decision, models that were not grounded in physics, but were designed to produce the conclusion management wanted to reach. He compared the agency's behavior to the organizational dysfunction that preceded both the Challenger disaster in 1986 and the Columbia disaster in 2003. In both of those cases, engineers had raised concerns about known risks, and in both cases, management had found ways to rationalize flying anyway. Challenger launched with O-rings that engineers knew were vulnerable to cold temperatures. Columbia launched with a foam insulation system that had been shedding debris and striking the orbiter's thermal tiles for years. In both cases, the agency treated an engineering problem as a scheduling problem and flew past it. In both cases, the crew died. Camarda is not the only dissenting voice. Former astronaut Danny Olivas, who served on an independent review team investigating the Artemis I heat shield, described it as a deviant heat shield, while stopping short of saying the crew is in immediate danger. Another independent expert estimated the probability of a heat shield failure specifically in the range of 1 in 5 to 1 in 50. That range is extraordinarily wide. A 1 in 50 probability is elevated but arguably defensible for a mission of this historic weight. A 1 in 5 probability is not. During NASA's final flight readiness review on March 12, 2026, some engineers objected to the launch. They were overruled. The mission was cleared to fly. The parallels to Challenger and Columbia are not rhetorical. They are structural. In 1986, engineers at Morton Thiokol warned that the O-ring seals on the solid rocket boosters had never been tested at the temperatures forecast for launch morning. They recommended a delay. NASA management pushed back. They asked the engineers to prove it was unsafe rather than proving it was safe, inverting the burden of evidence. The engineers could not definitively prove failure would occur, so the launch proceeded. 73 seconds later, Challenger broke apart. In 2003, a piece of foam insulation struck Columbia's left wing during launch, punching a hole in the thermal protection system. Engineers requested satellite imagery to assess the damage while the shuttle was still in orbit. The request was denied by management, who had already concluded that even if damage existed, there was nothing they could do about it. 16 days later, Columbia disintegrated during reentry. In both cases, the post-disaster investigations found the same pattern. A known engineering concern was acknowledged internally, but downgraded through a series of rational-sounding management decisions, until it was no longer treated as a threat. The concern did not disappear. It was simply reclassified until it fit inside the decision the agency had already made. The question hanging over Artemis II is whether this same pattern is repeating. An engineering failure was observed, the failure was acknowledged, an investigation was conducted, a workaround was proposed. Independent reviewers were brought in. The reviewers largely agreed with the workaround, but the workaround has never been tested at the speeds and conditions it will actually face. The heat shield that failed has not been replaced, and dissenting voices, including people with decades of thermal protection experience, were heard but ultimately overruled. That does not mean the decision is wrong. It means the decision carries a weight that will only be fully understood after Orion hits the atmosphere on day 10. And so on April 1st, 4 astronauts launched into space on top of the most powerful rocket ever flown by NASA, inside a spacecraft whose heat shield has already demonstrated a failure mode that the agency has never fully replicated or resolved. The workaround, the steeper reentry profile, has never been tested with crew. It has never been tested at all at lunar return speeds. The last time Orion flew this trajectory, the heat shield came back with over 100 points of damage and 3 melted bolts. The fix is a change in angle and speed. That's it. Right now, as you are hearing this, the Artemis II crew is somewhere between the Earth and the Moon. Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, and mission specialists Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen. They named their spacecraft Integrity. On day 6 of the mission, they will swing around the far side of the Moon, pass within 4,000 miles of the lunar surface, and briefly lose all contact with Earth as the Moon blocks their signal. They may set a new record for the farthest any human being has ever traveled from home, breaking the mark set by the crew of Apollo 13 in 1970, a crew that only went that far because their spacecraft was crippled, and they had no choice. The Artemis II crew chose to go. They will see the far side of the Moon with their own eyes, something no human being has done since December 1972. They will photograph Earthrise. They will look back at a planet that is, for a few days, impossibly far away, and then they will come home. On approximately April 10th, the Orion capsule will hit Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour, the fastest crewed re-entry ever attempted. Superheated plasma will engulf the spacecraft. Communications will black out. The heat shield will begin to ablate, and for several minutes, nobody on Earth will know whether the shield is holding or whether it's cracking again, whether the bolts are melting again, whether the gas is building beneath the surface again. The crew will feel the deceleration pressing them into their seats. They will hear the roar of atmosphere against the hull, and they will have to trust that the models were right, that the angle was enough, that the material will hold. It's probably going to work. Most of the experts believe it will. The independent review team believes it will. The crew believes it will, but probably is not the same as certainly. And the distance between those two words is exactly where Challenger lived, and exactly where Columbia lived, and exactly where Artemis II lives right now. NASA is not hiding a fatal flaw. They made a judgment call. They weighed the engineering risk against the programmatic cost of delay, and they chose to fly. That is what space agencies do. It is what they have always done. The question is not whether they had the right to make that call. The question is whether years from now we will look back at this decision the way we look back at every other decision like it, with the clarity that only comes after the outcome is known. The 4 astronauts aboard Orion understood the risk. They studied it, they accepted it, and they climbed aboard anyway, because that is what astronauts do. They sit on top of the danger and ride it into the dark, trusting that the people who built the machine got it right. Most of the time, they do, but not always. And the heat shield on Artemis II is a reminder that the margin between triumph and tragedy in spaceflight has never been as wide as we pretend it is. If you want to keep exploring what the universe is really doing, subscribe. I will see you in the next one.